It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live from the Green Space today with a Primary Day Politics special. Good morning, everyone. We will bring in our first guests in just a minute. But a big part of today's show, as we often do on election days, is open the phones for an informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific Brian Lehrer Show exit poll. So listeners, if you are voting today, let us know for whom and why at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Let me just alert the control room. Oh, no, I solved my technical problem. Never mind. A little behind the scenes, but a quick solution. So, listeners, who are you voting for governor, for lieutenant governor, for state attorney general, and in the many contested state senate primaries that could help to determine if Democrats or Republicans control the Senate next year? And we'll talk about why that has so much implication for policy in New York State. But on any of those races, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. It's our informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific Brian Lehrer Show exit poll. We'll talk about some national politics today, too, as we go along. And joining us first today on the Green Space stage, the three co-hosts of the new podcast that focuses on politics in New York called FAQ NYC. Christina Greer, Fordham University political science professor. Harry Siegel, a senior editor at the Daily Beast, also a Daily News columnist. And Azi Paybarah, now full-time with FAQ NYC, formerly with Politico New York, and formerly with us here at WNYC in our news department. So, hi, Christina. Hi, Harry. Azi. Hi, Harry. Welcome back to WNYC. And your latest podcast suggests that endorsements matter this year more than most. Azi, want to start us off and tell us why you say that?
Endorsements are a way of people who know a little bit about a race to get a little bit more information from trusted sources. Now, we all know that the media has been criticized in the last year or two by some people in Washington and elsewhere. But still, when newspapers report, they still have a currency with voters and people who are interested in local politics, and particularly when editorial boards, which are separate from newsrooms, when they interview candidates and they get these prolonged, extended conversations with candidates and ask them repeated questions, they sort of weigh these facts. And what we did on our latest episode was sort of pull the curtain back and say, are you just picking candidates that you think are the best, or does electability sort of play a factor in this because nobody wants to back too many losing horses in a race? So in an environment where people are inundated with content and not always information, endorsements can help play a crucial role, especially when there's not much separating candidates.
Right. And so I'm going to go down some endorsements just as kind of a service to our listeners who may be getting involved at the last minute in these races and are curious. You know, Christina, we could think of the people who, at least in our minds, maybe people really do this too in real life, walk into a voting booth with a New York Times endorsement cheat sheet in their hands and go down the list, or a Daily News or a New York Post, or pick your one. Mm-hmm. How much do you think people really do that?
In a race like this year, I think some people will definitely do that. You know, unfortunately, we've entered this hyper-partisan moment, and so most people won't do that, obviously, in November. But for primaries, where it seems to be a lot of noise and not necessarily a lot of information, I do think that some individuals will go with a trusted source. And for many New Yorkers, the New York Times or the Daily News or the Post, depending on, you know, the borough and the neighborhood, you'll take that in there and take that into account.
And so for governor, the Times, the Daily News, Newsday, and the Amsterdam News have all endorsed Cuomo. The New York Post did not endorse in the Democratic primary that we've been able to find. No local newspaper at that level has endorsed Cynthia Nixon. However, for Lieutenant Governor Jumaane Williams, Nixon's running mate, has been endorsed by both the Times and the Amsterdam News. The other papers did not take a position in the Lieutenant Governor's race. For Attorney General, the Times endorsed Zephyr Teachout, so did the Daily News. Letitia James was endorsed by Newsday and the Amsterdam News. So that's a start. And did you see, Harry, that Nicki Minaj endorsed Cuomo and issued a get out the vote appeal yesterday, specifically to the people of NYCHA?
And then I believe Cynthia Nixon asked Cardi B for her support.
Oh, I missed that.
But did not get a response. One of the weird things with the endorsements is that we have an attorney general's race because the editorial boards got involved much earlier when Eric Schneiderman stepped down, and Tish James pretty much had a deal to have the assembly give her the seat and make her the proto-incumbent. And the three boards spoke in unison, the Times, the News, and the Post, I think for the first time on an issue that big, since they were on the wrong side of it, in my view, after Mike Bloomberg met individually with all of their owners, and then they all decided that a third term and changing the law to allow him that was just fine. So that's one way they matter. And the other is when candidates come in and talk to Chrissy at the Amsterdam News or me when I was on the board at the Daily News, right? This is like a basic competence test of, like, I think a really important sort. Do you know what the budget for your office is? Do you know how much your tax cuts would cost? How many people are paying them? None of those are trick questions. They're not meant to trip anyone up. And when candidates can't get there or can't answer information, that first example was Nixon. Cuomo, as Alyssa Katz wrote today in the news, had his own problems disclosing other information. That really counts, and it's like information that voters wouldn't have otherwise, in a way of sort of holding power to account.
And is Cuomo that much of a hero to public housing residents, Azi, that Nicki Minaj would endorse Cuomo and specifically issue a get out the vote appeal to the people of NYCHA? And I'm really trying not to be funny with a Nicki Minaj endorsement. I think there's something very serious in appealing to people of NYCHA to turn out and vote for Cuomo specifically.
I mean, NYCHA is worthy of a whole show. There are
many shows.
Many shows.
As we've done.
So not to make light of a celebrity endorsement. Obviously, we've seen a lot of that. I think what you see with that is the effectiveness of an incumbent that has staff, that has campaign aides and operatives who can reach far and wide, further than you would immediately think, and get these kind of loud voices, these sort of validators. And we may, in the political press corps, may sort of laugh at a Nicki Minaj endorsement, but for people like my younger brother, who's in his 20s, doesn't have a television, that's a voice that he might hear before he might read an article in the Daily News or a column by Chrissy somewhere. So these voices speak out. And I think Cuomo is not necessarily a hero for NYCHA, but he is someone who has been recognized by critics and friends as someone who can accomplish things. And if you're in NYCHA and you're dealing with mold, lead paint, broken elevators, safety concerns, you want something done, and that might be a reason to go there.
Christina, same question.
Right. I would think, we have to remember almost 500,000 people live in NYCHA. They're not all voting eligible, but, that's a very large population to target in a primary. And just as Azi said, this is also targeting a particular racialized demographic and an underserved population of marginalized people in the city who may not turn out, right? Some people might think, well, because I live in these circumstances, what are these electeds going to do for me? And what Nicki Minaj is essentially saying is, this guy actually, he did come to NYCHA after Cynthia Nixon went to NYCHA, keep in mind. Remember when she went and then 3 days later, he's like, these conditions are atrocious. It's like, you do realize you used to be the head of HUD and you are currently the governor. But it took Cynthia Nixon to sort of wake him up to realize NYCHA needs to be a pressing issue. And I think some voters, some primary voters in NYCHA saw him visit, and they believe that, he will understand how to deal with the $168 billion budget better than Cynthia Nixon.
Let's start to see who some of our listeners are endorsing in our informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific primary day exit poll here on the Brian Lehrer Show. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. We'll start with line 9, Candida.
Yes.
Is
Hi,
it
Brian.
in Orange County? Hi, Candida.
Yes. I just voted. I was number 6 on my poll. I voted for Tito as the Attorney General and also for Cynthia Nixon because she is going to really represent everything that I'm about, much more than Governor Cuomo has had the opportunity for the last 2 terms that he has had. And I don't think he's going to change. So I want someone new, and I think Cynthia will be that person.
Did you say you were the number 3, meaning the 3rd person to show up at your polling place today?
No, number 6. Number 6.
Oh, number 6. And how long ago was that?
That was just about 40 minutes ago, about an hour ago.
Candida, thank you very much. And I don't know if that's an indication to anybody of low turnout if she was only number 6 at 9:30 in the morning. In my polling place, I saw up in Upper Manhattan, where I was there at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I was probably number 6 too, which is to say there was a little crowd there in Upper Manhattan. And relative to some other election days for that moment that they opened. So I don't know what we take from either of those things, Christina.
I'd be curious to know her neighborhood, just because, I'm in a...
It's Crawford, New York, so it's residential to exurban.
Okay. Listen, I think Cynthia Nixon's going to do better than I think the pundits and the polling shows, just because there is this frustration with Cuomo in a 3rd term. Oftentimes, the 3rd term is not the charm. And I do think that some people are thinking, well, you've had 8 years. What more are you trying to do? I mean, Cuomo was essentially presenting certain ideas as though he was running for the first time, and you've had almost a decade to do something about it. I'm very curious about the AG's race just because Sean Patrick Maloney has had ads on the air, but there is this, as Harry and Azi were saying, the New York Times endorsement really did wake a lot of people up, as did the Daily News endorsement.
The endorsement for Zephyr
Teachout, exactly.
Which seemed to change the shape of that race. I don't know if it changed the shape of that race. Harry, what do you think? Between, maybe it's just the gaze of us in the media that sees a New York Times endorsement and goes, oh, wow, where the real energy in that race for Zephyr Teachout existed prior to the New York Times endorsement, perhaps because she's from the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, and that's a very kind of below the mainstream media radar, organized on social media, organized at the community level kind of block. And I don't know if the New York Times endorsement changed the shape of that race. Do you think it did?
I'm not sure anything did. It changed the shape of the race for the candidates. You saw in the debate right after that everyone aimed their fire at Zephyr, who's running for the 3rd time, but I don't think is always a great politician, forgot to mention it more than twice in an hour-long debate. Everyone aimed their fire at her, so the other candidates suddenly said, this is the person to beat. The other issue is when you have a crowded field, right, there's 4 candidates there and 3 of them are very close. That creates its own complications. So Sean Patrick Maloney would have to give up what would be a competitive House seat, and is spending the money he got to run for that House seat to get into this race, is hoping that having 2 women there, and 2 women whose base of support is in New York City, I think rather cynically that opens up a lane for him, and he has a lot of money to spend on TV ads. So while there's a class that reads the Times endorsement, there's another that just knows, oh, that's the guy who's running.
Let's see. We have a report from a polling place in Levittown via Twitter. So someone says, I was there at 10 a.m. and I was number 16. I don't know how to read number 16. I don't know if that's a lot or a little at 10 a.m. in Levittown. But that person, sorry, I have to look over at my screen here, also voted for Cynthia Nixon and Licia Eve for Attorney General. Let's go to line 7. Judy in Elmsford. Judy, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. I have 3 recommendations that I'm going to vote for. One is Cynthia Nixon, because she doesn't have experience, but she has the right ideas, and Cuomo is too tied into the gas industry.
The gas industry, but he banned fracking statewide in New York.
Yeah,
I think he's the only governor.
Insane.
Say it again.
Pipelines are insane.
And
he supports them. He doesn't do anything to block them. I mean, we have one that's 142-inch diameter high-pressure gas line 105 feet from Indian Point. So he needs to do more. Well, he needs to get out. And my second endorsement, what I'm going to vote for, is Zephyr Teachout, because she understands the environmental situation and she does not take corporate money, and she's brilliant. And the third is I'm voting for Virginia Perez in my local state Senate primary. Against Andrea Stewart-Cousins.
Against Andrea Stewart-Cousins. Yeah. She's the hero of the anti-IDC movement, though. She's the one who's supposed to become Senate Majority Leader if the Democrats take a majority. Why?
Put calls into her about environmental issues, and she never got back to me, and she's totally unresponsive.
Judy,
and I think Virginia Perez will get it.
Thank you very much for your call. We appreciate it.
I think it's interesting no one's mentioning the lieutenant governor's race.
Yep.
You know, which to me is a very important race because, you know, Azi said this on the podcast, but, you know, for some people, there's this assumption that Cuomo's the heir apparent, and so they're looking at the LG and the AG's race to vote for someone who they think can be a foil to.
Right. You mean Cuomo's the presumed winner.
Exactly.
So they might vote.
So a possible Williams or Teachout would serve as a check and balance onto what they assume will be a Cuomo third term.
Right. And again, interesting that both the Times and the Amsterdam News, the only two papers that I see that endorsed in both the governor and lieutenant governor races, they did in effect split their ticket. So Cuomo, but not his running mate, the current lieutenant governor, Kathy Hochul, they both endorsed Jumaane Williams, who is running to be a kind of progressive check on Governor Cuomo and progressive sort of pressure point on him if he gets into office. So that's the last thing that Andrew Cuomo wants, Azi.
Right. So two things. Number one, in 1982, when Mario Cuomo was running against Ed Koch for governor, the Times endorsed Ed Koch, but then also endorsed Mario Cuomo's running mate to be Koch's running mate. That person's name was Carl McCall, who later went on to run for governor. But a second point.
But then didn't the opposite happen? Mario Cuomo won.
Yes.
But somebody who was not his chosen running mate.
But Ed Koch's running mate won, and that dichotomy created attention, and that lieutenant governor didn't serve for a full term. He ended up leaving.
Right, because he had nothing to do. That was a very different dynamic, though, Harry, right? If we look at that ancient history of 1982, that lieutenant governor was just marginalized by Governor Mario Cuomo. Jumaane Williams would not be marginalizable. He would be out there holding news conferences, issuing statements, things like that, because he sees his role differently.
So this is interesting history. Of course, Andrew Cuomo first runs for governor against Carl McCall, doesn't wait his turn, and gets crushed. This is
2002.
Yeah, 20 years later. Jumaane Williams, who, just because of how term limits work in New York, needed a next place to go to, wants to be this needle or this foil to the governor. And the Times, in their gritted teeth endorsement of Cuomo, Cuomo's a terrible guy and a disappointment, but he knows how to get things done. And if he's pressured, maybe we can make him, sort of enthusiastically embrace this idea of shifting the pressure to his left. And this, in fact, has been Bill de Blasio's dream since coming into office, and is the origin really of his fight with Cuomo in a lot of ways, is saying we can get the state Senate all the way to the left, and then the state can give me much more money for this millionaire's tax I wanted, and the Cuomo, who was then running for re-election, had no interest in giving him, and was furious. He kept asking. He said, I've given you money already. Like, don't make me raise taxes in an election year. So all these guys have this incredibly interesting and entangled history with each other, and Cuomo came into office after a bunch of dysfunctional governors, and he said, I'm going to pass a budget on time, I'm not going to raise taxes, I'm going to do a lot of like socially conscious things with some help from Mike Bloomberg bribes to recalcitrant previously state senators, and that was good enough, and that's still where he's at. It's that the ground is very close to shifting under him as suddenly all these challengers are emerging from the left, and his position as the essential central middleman is threatened, and he's run in that course, which he has before, and in 1982 even. I won't get into the specifics of that, but there was, for a second time, very nasty invective directed at Ed Koch. He's run some incredibly nasty ads at the end of this, even as polls show him up by a tremendous amount. false accusations from the Democratic Party he controls. They said they didn't know who put them out, and then it was some community advisor, and then it turns out it was a senior advisor to the governor making false allegations about Cynthia Nixon's beliefs on Jewish and Israel-related issues just before the election. So it's incredible how this old history keeps cycling, and these new people are coming up, potentially, if Jumaane wins, which I think he will, and if Zephyr does, which I think she might. The dynamic he's in changes, and he's no longer the man at the center, and he's struggling with that already. And the last thing is, he's a terrible campaigner, and he always has been. He was terrible against McCall. Yep. He wouldn't really campaign against Zephyr 4 years ago. He's very gifted at wielding power, which is a different thing. And he controls this large budget, these agencies that are off the state budget books that are billions of dollars more, over that, 146, or I believe. So you're seeing him struggle in new and interesting ways that say something about how the Democratic Party has shifted beneath him while he's been in office, and the expectations of voters have, even as he's very likely, I think, to win this primary. He's been damaged severely by this exercise.
Do any of you think that that last-minute mailer, which the Times editorial board and everybody else called sleazy, was a sign that Cuomo is more worried about how this race might turn out than the polls, which have a big gap, would indicate? Azi?
I think it shows there's a concern, but I don't know if it's about losing or just about being embarrassed with a small victory. And it also shows what some of his campaign people think is appropriate. To have government officials sort of step away from their government roles and campaign like this, like that commingling. They think that's okay. They think that's appropriate. They think these are the issues that voters are going to decide on. When Andrew Cuomo, the first time he was a candidate in 2002, and many times since, he's projected himself as someone who says, let's talk about issues, let's not be negative. And if you're talking about the other person, that says you don't have anything to say about yourself. And then his aides do this. Mm-hmm. So that really says something about who Cuomo says he is and who Cuomo really is.
And then,
go ahead, Christine.
I also just, alluding to what Azi said, sometimes a win isn't a win, right? And so when he ran against Zephyr, or when Zephyr ran against him 4 years ago, and she got a third of the vote, which shocked most of New York, he won, but it was slightly embarrassing. And I think he's really concerned about the percentages, especially because he thinks that he has a future in 2020. So you can't hobble into success in your primary with your challenger, an actress with no political experience, getting over 30%, right?
Although if Cynthia Nixon gets just a third of the vote today and Cuomo gets 2/3, that would mean he beats her by more than 30 points, and that would be considered a good win for him at this point, wouldn't it?
He'd frame it that way, but I think, and I think he'll be okay, obviously, in November, but he's not thinking about November. He's thinking about 2020. And so,
is he thinking about 2020?
He's thinking about it. No one else is thinking about it.
Well, I'm only asking because in the debate on Channel 2, he said he will not run for president. The only way he would not finish out this next 4-year term, if reelected, is if an act of God strikes him dead. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's as close to a politician actually ruling something out as I could think of.
Right. And we know that Cuomo has shown himself to be abundantly trustworthy these past few years.
Right. I also think he's thinking about January. If his coattails don't bring along Kathy Hochul for lieutenant governor, if it doesn't bring along his preferred lieutenant governor, Attorney General, if it also emboldens legislators to stand up to him, that's a very long third term. And he may want that alternative option that he jokingly suggested.
But he's running as the progressive hope of New York to fight Trump. So is he also at the same time worried that the state legislature will go more Democratic and stand up to him from the left? Is that what you're suggesting, Azi?
Yeah, because Cuomo has a history of moderating positions. The $15 minimum wage that the New York Times editorial board and other people give him credit for, that's phased in over 6 years, and it's not indexed to the price of inflation, which means by the time you get your $15, it's not even worth $15. So Cuomo is very smart. He's done some very good things. The SAFE Act is a bolder step than most other governors have taken in the wake of gun violence. But there's other things he's done where the headline looks really good, but when you look at the details, activists who know the information say that's not enough, and some legislators might be willing to challenge him more on those issues.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space for our Primary Day Politics special. By the way, I'll be back tonight at 9 o'clock, which is when the polls close at New York, for an hour or so of election returns coverage. We'll see what they can determine by 10 o'clock tonight and whether we have to stay on longer. But we will be doing live primary returns, which I'll be anchoring tonight at 9 o'clock here on WNYC. My guests right now are the three co-hosts of the new New York City politics, I guess New York City and state politics podcast called FAQ NYC, Harry Siegel, Azi Paybarah, and Christina Greer. And we have our informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific primary day exit poll going on the phones at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. And Christina, here's how thoroughly unscientific it is. So far, the only calls we're getting in the governor's race, and we'll get to state senate and some of the other things as we go along in the show, the only calls we're getting so far in the governor's race are from people voting for Cynthia Nixon.
Right.
And so we don't take that as statistically representative, but what we...
I won't use this in my stats class next semester.
I wouldn't recommend it. But what does happen on talk radio all the time in various ways, and I think we're seeing an example of it right here, is that the people with the most passion about an issue, or in this case a choice, tend to call in. And usually the people who are most unhappy with the status quo tend to call in. People call in to complain about something more than they call in to say that politician or that corporation or whatever is doing a great job. And I think it suggests a question, though, which is who feels strongly about Andrew Cuomo? Right? We know that people feel strongly about Cynthia Nixon, who are supporting Cynthia Nixon for all the progressive issue reasons and things like that. And yet Cuomo does have this big lead in the polls. But are there people out there who go, God, I really like Andrew. I'm getting out there. So how do those two things fit together, the big lead and that there's no apparent passion?
Right. You know, I think some of it's name recognition, not just for himself, but for his family. I think that some people are thinking about November.
And the bridge. Don't forget the bridge.
Oh, and the bridge, I'm going to put in quotes.
My father, Tappan Z. No.
Right. I mean, you know, I do think that some people are thinking about November and thinking that Cuomo is a better challenger to Molinaro. I think that, unfortunately, Cynthia Nixon has some Trump effect, where because he is so grossly incompetent, they're seeing her as a celebrity with no real policy background or electoral politics background. So there doesn't seem to be real passion for Andrew Cuomo, yet he knows how to raise money. He's got all the union endorsements, and he seems just fine. I do want to sort of circle back, though, and we have to really think about turnout, because so many legislators in New York have structured it such that they've made it so difficult for us to participate. You know, I mean, I think New York has more draconian laws than, say, like Alabama and Mississippi. And this may be a case of the chickens coming home to roost for some of these incumbents, because in a low turnout race, it usually helps an incumbent. But when we see this groundswell that Harry and Azi were talking about with the left and sort of this quasi-civil war going on in the party, where you have these new people who actually are excited about insurgent candidates, that actually does not service incumbents well, and this is how you can get knocked off with 2,000 votes.
And it flips the script on turnout, perhaps, that maybe in this scenario, low turnout actually favors Cynthia Nixon, because
exactly.
The people who will turn out are the people who care. Azi, you're nodding your head.
I nod my head whenever Chrissy talks. But
it's Pavlovian now.
Yes. But think about your MTA ride. Whenever it's sort of okay, you don't feel the need to say, thanks for my okay ride, MTA. But when it gets stalled, I go from 0 to outrage really quickly, and I want to tweet about, you know, getting my money back for this ride. If people are upset, they will come out and vote. If people think Andrew Cuomo has it in the bag, it's not such a big deal, it's raining, it's Thursday, he'll win, he doesn't need me. There's a sense of urgency that benefits challengers. And I think that one of the tricks for Cuomo is just talking electoral campaign strategy. If it looks like it is a race, if it looks like it is close, if people see there's blood in the water, if they smell something in the air, that could give a surge to his challenger. So how does he convince people to show up without breaking a sweat saying, I need you?
Mm-hmm.
And so we invite, and I mean this seriously, people who are voting for Cuomo today to call in and be part of this conversation, because the last thing we want to do is give a false impression. I joke about how this is a thoroughly unscientific exit poll, and it is, but we also want to have the conversation that people may be having with themselves, with yourselves, at the last minute here, if you're undecided but want to vote. We're getting Nixon calls, and we'll continue to take them. Let's get some Cuomo callers. If you're out there, why are you voting for Andrew Cuomo today? If you are, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. But for the moment, we'll go to line 7, Beth on the Lower East Side. Hello, Beth. You're on WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for taking my call. So I did vote this morning. I was actually number 1 at my polling place, and I voted for...
Beth's number 1.
Yes.
Beth, what time was that, by the way?
It was 6 o'clock. I was just finishing walking my dog.
As it opened.
And as it turns out, my polling place is in my building, so it's very convenient. So I can't take too much
People are laughing because in America, they don't expect it to be easy to vote, right? You have to look up this obscure thing and go around the block, like in my neighborhood, to this sort of industrial section near the used car lot, car repair places.
Right.
It's in your building. That's
It's in
too
my
easy.
building.
It's like Australia.
Yeah, it's great. But I voted for Cynthia Nixon. I like her a lot. I think it also was a strongly anti-Cuomo vote because I'm just so sick of him. And, I have a laundry list of complaints about him, including his shutting down the Corruption Commission, his embrace of Eva Moskowitz. And I don't buy for a second that he didn't know about that flyer that came out. And I also voted for Zephyr Teachout, and I was actually at the debate that you moderated last week.
Uh-huh.
So, and I thought that I think she's really strong. I think she got really beaten up last week, but and I came away feeling that all 4 of them were very strong candidates. But Letitia James, her affiliation with Cuomo really turned me off.
And did you say something to our screener about de Blasio?
Yes, that was the other thing about Cuomo, that the dynamic between him and Bill de Blasio, I just think is so petty and so destructive to the city, and it just feels like it's so ego
on Cuomo's part.
On Cuomo, yeah.
Beth,
yeah.
Thank you very much for your call.
Of course.
So Harry Siegel, talking about endorsements, why didn't Mayor de Blasio endorse in the governor's race? He strung everybody along and said, I'm going to make up my mind when it's really going to have an impact in the days before the campaign. And then over this past weekend, he announced, I'm not endorsing for governor at all.
He did. I don't believe he's endorsing for AG either. He strung that out like 6 p.m. on a Saturday, 6 p.m. on a Friday, after promising that he was finally going to get there. De Blasio's had a lot of trouble positioning himself politically, even as he anticipated this progressive wave rising nationally very early. His efforts to show himself as atop that, or leading that, have been consistently embarrassing. He's had candidate forums no one's shown up to. He was sort of exiled to knock on random doors for Hillary, and this has continued. And I think in his role as mayor of New York, not seeing any chance, in his view, for Nixon to get over the top, and I want to come back to that in 1 second, he decided that it wasn't worth it, and that makes him look ridiculous yet again. And I think it's actually probably the right thing to do here. I don't think anyone cares that much what he says, and I think he could have done damage by endorsing. With all that said, the reason Cuomo is running against Cynthia Nixon, an actress with no electoral experience, like in this Trump era, is every Democrat who had office already decided it just wasn't worth it, right? So the inevitability starts before the campaign even starts, as people are thinking about whether or not to get into this race. And he has this tremendous war chest, like one $60,000 LLC contribution at a time, that discourages serious candidates from getting involved and allows him to point in that direction. On the flip side of that, if Tish James wins And this is part of why she was partnering with Cuomo. She's had a lot of trouble raising money previously and has been something of an outsider. She won her council seat just with the Working Families Party line, not also as a Democrat. First one to do that, right? She's never been good at raising money. Cuomo has basically infinite money. And the proposition is passion counts for a lot, but if you can flood the TV ads, if you're the candidate people know is running, that all the people who don't care that much but do show up and vote, and you're the candidate they recognize and think of as the default, that ends up being worth it. So the danger, which is the last thing here, and I think is important, and this almost happened to Mike Bloomberg in 2009, when he spent a lot of time telling everyone there was no race and there was nothing to see here, move on, is that your opponent overperforms, and the people who would vote for you, if they were really worried about your opponent winning, decide it's safe to cast a protest vote. And in a weird year, and we've had those, anyone remember 2016? Sometimes people who don't expect to win can, and we end up in an odd place. We'll see.
Right. Can I just also say, you know, part of my frustration is fortune favors the bold, and I really thought that Stephanie Miner should have run in the primary.
Yes.
She's currently the former mayor of Syracuse.
Liberal wing Democrat.
Right. And now she's running as an independent in the general. Who cares? And she might, you know, take some percentages and make things interesting, but I think with her background and her level of expertise, if she ran against Cuomo in a primary, I think she would have been a formidable candidate because she'd get people who literally see her as someone who's legitimate, but also she'd get the anti-Cuomo vote.
And
so I think she could have won.
And maybe to that point, our next caller, who is a Cuomo voter, is going to reinforce part of that. Kathy in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Brian. I love your show.
Thank you.
Yes, so I'm a kind of anti-Cynthia Nixon voter, and I realize that's a very unpopular sentiment, particularly among my progressive friends. And I am a progressive, but I find the idea that a celebrity is again running for a major office without a scintilla of experience horrifying. And I just don't want this to become what happens going forward. I don't care that she's a celebrity. I care that she has no experience, but seems to think that by dint of being a celebrity, she can run the state of New York.
Thank you very much.
I've heard that sentiment.
Did I hear a little smattering of applause out there?
Yeah, I've heard the sentiment expressed by that caller before.
Yeah,
that
me too.
Democrats believe in government, and therefore the best and the brightest sort of go towards that as a career, and Republicans, for the most part, think smaller government is better, and their best and the brightest generally go towards the private sector. And there's always been that sort of dichotomy. So when the Democratic Party starts embracing celebrity candidates who are charismatic and have no experience, then you start seeing these weird sort of anomalies. Now, 2008, Barack Obama had less experience than Hillary Clinton, and the experience argument didn't quite work there. And there's an argument.
He at least had been a long-term state legislator in Illinois
and a law professor. I mean, he had a lot more credentials and experience than the person who's currently in office.
U.S. Senator.
Right, but if you start chipping away at the value of experience in one race, you can start seeing how voters get habituated to a new normal.
We'll continue in a minute. Brian Lehrer with our Primary Day special, live from the Green Space, and our informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific exit poll. Who are you voting for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and in any state Senate race? 212-433-WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Jerome L. Green Performance Space here at WNYC today with a Primary Day special. With me now, we continue with the three co-hosts of the new New York City Politics podcast, FAQ NYC, Azi Paybarah, with Harry Siegel, Daily News columnist and Daily Beast senior editor, and Christina Greer, Fordham University political science professor. Let me digress for a minute. What happened?
They like us.
Oh, they liked you. Oh, I see. I thought I missed something. It's just you guys inherently worthy of applause.
We'll take that vote.
And I want you all out there in Radio Land right now, ready, applause for Harry, Ozzy, and Christina in your living room, not in your car, not if you're driving.
Right.
Let me digress for a minute to national politics. You all write or comment about national politics, too. And this is actually not directly a Trump question. I'm going to play a clip from a Paul Ryan speech in Wisconsin yesterday that played into something that I've been thinking about a lot. He denounced identity politics, you'll hear him do that, and says he wants to work on bringing back the opposite, non-tribal aspirational politics. And for him, with his political points of view, built on free market conservatism. And I want to talk about whether they're actually the opposite of each other. Here is 40 seconds of Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan.
21st century technology has proven that tribalism and identity politics is effective. More to the point, which is even worse, people make money off of it. What I want to spend my time thinking about is how do you make inclusive, aspirational, unifying politics, it's free market conservative, the stuff I believe in, how do you make it strategically valuable? How do you make it that this is the winning thing? This is how you should conduct campaigns. This is what wins elections. You literally had to figure out how to beat tribalism and show that it's the right, it's not just morally right, but you have to show that it's actually strategically the right thing to do. And we have a ways to go on that.
So, Christina, this jumped out at me because I tend to be critical of the Paul Ryan wing of the conservative movement for claiming to be the firewall against Trump-style tribalism when the things that he has fought for his whole career could be seen as white identity politics by another name. Like anti-poverty programs, which he thinks are too robust, affirmative action, government-subsidized health insurance, all of that was, you know, to him, supporting the undeserving poor, and we know who they are perceived to be. So it's been a softer way for conservatives to develop white grievance, I think, over the last few decades. Now all Trump is doing is saying out loud what a lot of Paul Ryan, Ayn Rand, if you will, supporters have been thinking all along. That's my rant. Any thoughts?
I think you're spot on, per usual. You know, Trump has only excavated what was already there. It's not new. I mean, look at the history of this nation, chattel slavery, genocide, etc. So when we think about identity politics, it's often put on people of color or women, and you know they're just voting for Hillary because she's a woman. But white male identity politics has been essentially the baseline level of politics. That is the identity politics. So whenever people deviate ever so slightly from that, it's seen as tribalism. So, for example, in 2008, when so many pundits and journalists said, well, you know, blacks are just voting for Obama because he's black. And I said, you know, guess what? There are a lot of whites who are just voting for John McCain because he's white. And so we know that this particular president and administration and Republican Party is going out of their way to make things racialized. We can't forget when Donald Trump descended from that gold escalator, he talked about Mexicans and Muslims and the blacks consistently. So for Paul Ryan's about to cash out. This is him trying to, you know, say something of quasi-relevance, but he's just going to go with the rest of his Republican colleagues and leave their jobs as quote-unquote public servants and make money off of the same tribalism they're talking about.
And free market politics means allowing the market with little government intervention to determine poverty and prosperity in America, which, Harry, could be seen as another way of saying locking in the advantages and disadvantages of hundreds of years of race-based wealth accumulation policies. How do you hear Paul Ryan? I don't know if you're on any different page on this.
Pull the ladder up. I mean, he's saying what he means, and he's saying what he means in that different register politicians do, as Chrissy said, when they're looking to cash out or shift gears or roles, right? So he's not going to be running for elected office now. There's a whole donor class that has priorities that are different from Trump and would certainly like not to have some things that Republicans have thought for a long time made explicit, and he can help carry some of their water. People shift when the roles shift. So here in the city, right, like all these politicians endorsed Tish James, but she went with Andrew Cuomo, not because they thought one thing or the other of her, but because it opened up a seat. When Andrew Cuomo came to office and we'd had incompetence and there was this whole set of IDC questions, what people wanted was one thing. His politics shifted. When Rudy Giuliani was mayor and he loved immigrants, he thought one thing. His position changed. His demands changed. That's actually, to some extent, how this is supposed to work, is people play their positions, listen to the forces that they should be responsive to, and decide what the play is. The question is if those forces can be shaped so that they're decent and a public pressure on elected officials, on people who want to speak for broader parts of the public and help make that a better and more honorable discourse, or if it just allows people to say, let's find better new packaging for the ugly stuff we've been doing for a long time now that some of it has been more explicitly exposed.
And we've been talking about endorsements a lot this hour. Your latest podcast episode is about endorsements in the context of this primary day. You remind me, Harry, of one of the most surprising endorsements in the relatively recent history of New York City when Rudy Giuliani was mayor in 1994 and Mario Cuomo was running for his fourth term as governor. Do you remember who Rudy Giuliani endorsed? He endorsed Mario Cuomo over George Pataki, the Republican, running for governor, even though just the year before, Rudy Giuliani had been elected over David Dickens to become the first Republican mayor of New York in a long time.
Do you want to blow all your political capital the next year on going with a long shot candidate from your party? And Giuliani made what seemed like the right choice and backfired fairly spectacularly.
Because Pataki won.
Yeah. Yeah, he said, you know, forget this guy. Cuomo is the power, and we're going to need the power. I'm with Cuomo. And this is actually the case for de Blasio, having learned from the disaster right after he was first elected. And he said, I've got this mandate, and Albany's going to do what I say now. And he found out that Albany didn't give a damn what he said, staying quiet this year and trying to protect the city's interests. And this goes back to this question of what politicians are supposed to do. They're not supposed to speak their true hearts. I don't actually care what's in their true hearts. I care how they're going to act on my behalf and like what values they're going to express in that role. Whatever's behind that honestly seems like very little of my business.
Who in the green space wants to either say who you're voting for today in the New York primary or make any comment here or ask a question? We have hands up. We have somebody right down front here. Can you bring a mic right to the front row? Hi.
Hi, Brian. I heard a guest on your show earlier this week refer to Cuomo as the kinder, gentler Donald Trump, and opined that the people who had benefited under Cuomo's 8 years were the same people who were benefiting under Trump, the super wealthy, the corporations, etc. And I wondered, you know, Cuomo has aligned himself as this anti-Trump candidate. I'm the person to take on Trump. But is Cuomo responsible in his last 8 years for the rise of Trump? He has overseen the New York that created Trump. Trump is a result of the same New York politics, the manipulation of city councils, manipulation of the mayors, the building process, the planning process, the union manipulation, everything that Trump has existed in that New York system. Is that the system that Cuomo is actually more aligned with? Is that why Cuomo is having such trouble?
Certainly he takes a lot of real estate donations, but beyond that, Christina, is that a stretch?
I don't subscribe to that philosophy. I've definitely heard it before. To me, Cuomo was raised in captivity. I mean, he's been in Albany since he was 17 years old. This is what he knows, right? I think he's an institutionalist, and I think that he also is much smarter than Trump. I mean, the only thing that Trump believes in is Trump and himself and his money, right? Where I don't think that that's the case with Andrew Cuomo. I think that this is why primaries are important, because we've seen that he can be pushed and he can evolve over time. I think that there's a certain anti-intellectualism that the president has that Cuomo doesn't have. I do think it is problematic that he is so embedded in certain institutional structures that seem to be leaning on the line of legality or morality, and closing down Moreland Commission definitely was highly offensive and problematic.
That was an ethics investigation panel that he put together, but when they started looking at donors to him, he shut it down.
Exactly. And so he does things like that, and he definitely is a bully. I mean, I'm from Queens too, so, you know, I get it. But I don't see the two of them as the twins that people keep trying to make them out to be.
Ozzy and I are from Queens too, I should say, but I was more the one who got bullied, but that's another show.
I always have to say, I have two things in common with the president. We're both from Queens, and we both have heel spurs. That's it. It stops there.
The idea that Donald Trump came from the New York political environment where real estate money commingles so easily with people in power, and you think that gives you access and permission to do things that other people can't do that don't have that kind of money. I wouldn't say Cuomo created that, but he hasn't changed it, and he hasn't done away with it. And to put a small plug in for our podcast, we sort of addressed this when we did an episode about the Attorney General candidates, where we asked them basically, was Donald Trump an outlier of the New York real estate economy and the way things are, or is he emblematic of it? And if you're an Attorney General, what are you going to do about it? And if you go onto iTunes or Stitcher or something, you can hear that episode. And we sort of talk about where Donald Trump came from, which is this New York area that we all know, and the things that he was able to do because of that.
Anyone else with a hand up? I can't always see because the light's on the stage. Anyone else with a hand up at this moment in the green space? No. Okay. Whenever anybody wants to chime in or ask a question, just put your hand up and we'll come around. I guess since we've been talking about endorsements a lot, we should mention, Christina, that you're a member of the Amsterdam News editorial board, right?
Endorsement board.
Endorsement
board. That's
board.
what it's called, the endorsement board, yes.
So how do you and the Amsterdam News endorsed Cuomo, which maybe a casual outsider might say, look and say, well, that's a progressive newspaper that might align more with Cynthia Nixon's political positions. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. So how does the Amsterdam News endorsement board come to Andrew Cuomo?
We interviewed both candidates for roughly an hour or so, and the consensus was, Cynthia Nixon has some brilliant people running her campaign. Shout out to Rebecca Katz. But I think that this experiment, many of us felt, had gone as far as it should go. So going back to the previous caller, thinking about a budget of $168 billion, thinking about someone whose personality I personally don't find too inviting in the governor, but I'm not electing him to be my friend. I'm electing him to work with mayors across the state and our elected officials in Albany. And so I think a lot of people felt that Cynthia Nixon served a great purpose to push the governor left on things like NYCHA, on marijuana, on housing and prisons, and even the environment still. But as far as someone being the leader of the state, as an entertainer, as someone who's dabbled in policy but not necessarily electoral politics, there was a certain level of discomfort in endorsing someone who's such a political novice for an executive role for one of, I might argue, one of the most important states of the 50.
And on the other hand, Harry, did I see that you tweeted your vote this morning?
I changed my vote today. I've never done that before, to Cynthia Nixon, very reluctantly, because of the mailer and hiding from the press and the way this last week of the campaign has played out. I just thought it was utterly dishonorable. What Cuomo and Trump really have in common is that they're two guys from Queens who are self-identified men's men who are in the psychic shadow of their fathers. And they both do come out of New York real estate, but one didn't cause the other. They also both want, and then there's a very key distinction, this suggestion that they've caused things that they haven't. Neither man caused the other, neither of them caused this swamp. It's just the environment that they've operated in. Ben Smith made a really important point, longtime New York reporter is now the editor of BuzzFeed, about the distinction, which is that Trump is a system smasher and a rule breaker who parades doing that. And Cuomo is someone who works entirely within the system and according to the exact letter of the rules as he understands them, often to his convenience at that point. And I think that's all these reluctant endorsements and people deciding to stay with him is if he can be forced to the left, if he can be held to account, he's somebody who will operate that way in our interests. We may get to find out.
I don't endorse. Azi, do you endorse?
No.
There's a soul-searching piece by Daily News editorial board member Alyssa Katz, who says even as part of the board that endorsed Cuomo for re-election, she has been wavering in her personal last-minute decision because of a big thing Cuomo did in his first term that hasn't even come up in this conversation or in the election season in general, allow the Republicans to redistrict the state in their favor after the 2010 census, the opposite of his pledge to support a nonpartisan districting reform plan. Piece of New York history that some of you may remember, that former Mayor Ed Koch made that the final political crusade of his life before he died, getting New York State elected officials to pledge to support nonpartisan districting. And Azi, can you pick up the story from there?
And the governor in his first term, the cynical reading of history is that he traded the Republican state Senate's ability to draw their own lines for them allowing same-sex marriage to come up for a vote, which he then marshaled enough votes to come across and pass. And when Cuomo was asked, why did you renege on your promise to veto district lines drawn by lawmakers themselves, he said, I didn't break my promise. I got the nonpartisan redistricting. I just didn't get it this year. I'm getting it in the future. So what he did was he said the lawmakers will be allowed to sort of draw their own lines, and the bill that sort of like allowed this to happen says the next time we all get together and draw lines, it'll be nonpartisan. So Cuomo is very much...
That would mean after the 2020 census.
Yes, which is right around the corner. But right when he signed the law, it didn't feel that way. So Cuomo was saying, I got what you wanted, but everyone was assuming he was talking about the present tense, and he was saying, no, I'm looking into the future.
Let's take another call on line 9. Steve on the Upper West Side. Steve, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Yes, I am an enthusiastic supporter of Governor Cuomo, I think he's been a strong governor. I admit that when I spoke to your screener, I inadvertently said Mario Cuomo, and so make of that what you will.
I make it that you're old. Just play.
Friends of mine have said to me that he's a political hack, and I've responded yes, but he's my political hack. So I think it's too important this time, where we are in our history, to take any chance with a complete novice. Our state's too important to the rest of the country, and certainly with people within the state to sort of take a chance with something like that. I don't want to be in a situation where we're in a oops moment. And I appreciate a lot of my friends and colleagues on the progressive movement who are jumping up and down and saying, this is going to be wonderful, but there's a practical reality. So there was no way. I've never voted for Nixon, and I never will.
Steve, thank you very much. Line 3, Tim in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Tim, hi.
Morning, Brian. I know I have to make it quick. I am going to vote for Zephyr Teachout on account of attending your excellently moderated debate last week, and it's really a choice of corruption, blatant corruption, or inexperience, and I'll take inexperience. Letitia James' statement that she won't be the sheriff of Wall Street is really in and of itself corruption and should disqualify her from office. And I'm going to vote against Cuomo because of his history of blatant corruption, in-your-face corruption, and I cannot abide that, and I must vote in opposition to that.
Tim,
so I'm going to vote for Nixon.
Thank you very much for your call. We're just about out of time with our first set of guests. I'll throw in one thing here. One of your podcast episodes this summer was called The Curse of Tom Suozzi. Azi, what's The Curse of Tom Suozzi, and why is it relevant to today?
Tom Suozzi was the insurgent challenger to a proto-incumbent gubernatorial candidate. Tom Suozzi was a Nassau County executive. He ran for governor against Eliot Spitzer, who was the establishment favorite. And if you want to know how difficult it is to run a campaign against an establishment, against someone that has money, institutional support, the last guy to try it was Tom Suozzi. And he told us how hard it was to go from local politics, where he seemed to be really good, to statewide politics. And I thought that shed a light on some of the challenges Cynthia Nixon is facing. We tried to get her on our show, and schedules didn't quite work out. But Tom Suozzi, who has experience in this scenario, was more than happy to tell us all about what he did right and the many things he did wrong.
We thank Harry Siegel, also a senior editor at the Daily Beast and a Daily News columnist, Christina Greer, also a Fordham University political science professor and a member of the Amsterdam News Endorsement Board, and Azi Paybarah, all three the co-hosts of the new New York City Politics podcasts, FAQ NYC. Thank you for answering many great Qs today. Thank you all very much. Happy Primary Day.
And thank you.
Thank you guys. Yeah.
And